And it seems to me that we should defeat what is really an unnecessarily costly amendment, an ill-advised and ill-timed one. And so I would urge defeat of this amendment, Mr. Chairman.
For what purpose does the gentlelady from Michigan rise?
Mr. Chairman, I move to strike the requisite number of words.
Gentlelady is recognized for 5 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, in advance of last fall, the election last fall, the Republican conference presented a governing document called the Pledge to America, which put forward our ideas on how we intended to deal with the unsustainable level of deficit spending that has created a crippling debt being forced upon our children, our grandchildren, and future generations. The American people agreed with us and entrusted the Republican Party with a new majority here in the House in order to carry out what we had put forward. And in that pledge, we promised that we would cut $100 billion from the fiscal year 2011 budget. And with the passage of this legislation, the underlying legislation which I support, we will have kept that promise, Mr. Chairman. Unfortunately, President Obama did not seem to get that message, as he has threatened to veto this legislation. The President remains committed to an agenda that calls for ever higher spending, higher taxes, trillion-dollar deficits, huge debt, and a government that is out of control. The President presented his budget to the Congress this past Monday, and the President patted himself on the back by saying that his budget, Mr. Chairman, reduces the deficit by over the next 10 years by about $1 trillion, but he said little of the fact that, according to his own math, more than $7 trillion would be added to our national debt. And today our national debt is in excess of $14 trillion. And at the end of the President's 10-year budget window, it will be nearly $23 trillion. It's clear that the President's budget was not a governing document like the Pledge to America was. It was a political document in which he refused to take on the tough challenges that we face in our nation. In the Illinois State Senate, President Obama, then State Senator Obama, voted present. He voted present 130 times, refusing to take a position on the various issues facing his state. And in his irresponsible budget on Monday, President Obama once again voted present. Mr. Chairman, President Obama needs to know that with the many challenges facing our nation, that now is not the time to vote present. Now is the time to provide leadership. You don't have to believe me that the President's budget doesn't provide the serious leadership that our nation needs now. Just read the Washington Post, one of the President's strongest supporters in the media, which said this about the Obama budget. It said, the President punted, having been given the chance, the cover, and the push by the Fiscal Commission that he created to take the bold steps to raise revenue and curb entitlement spending. President Obama, in his fiscal 2012 budget proposal, chose instead to duck, and to mask some of the ducking with the sort of budgetary gimmicks that he once derided. Well, Mr. Chairman, punting in football is the equivalent of voting present in politics. And by once again voting present, the President refused the mantle of leadership at a time of fiscal crises in our nation. Mr. Chairman, we in the Republican Party will take that mantle and continue to put forward an agenda for America that gets our fiscal house in order and empowers the private sector to create new jobs. We listen to the American people, and they can see today our seriousness in dealing with the out-of-control spending problem we have. In our budget, we will show once again that we are serious about reducing these unsustainable deficits. And we understand, Mr. Chairman, that out-of-control government spending, borrowing, and debt limits the opportunities. It limits the opportunities available to our children and to our grandchildren to help them achieve the American dream. We will continue to tackle these tough issues head-on. And if President Obama believes that his political supporters simply will attack all of our efforts to return this nation to fiscal sanity, if he believes that by voting present, by taking a pass on the tough decisions, that somehow he'll gain political advantage, Mr. Chairman, I believe that the President has seriously underestimated the political will of the American people and seriously misread the message from the last election. The American people, Mr. Chairman, understand that the status quo is not sustainable. They understand that we cannot build our economy on top of a mountain of debt. and the American people understand that it is simply unacceptable for the leader of our nation at this time in our history to be voting present. And this week, the members of the House are making the difficult choices on this continuing resolution which we have been debating this week. And the Republican majority will be presenting our budget in the near future, and we will not be voting present. I yield back.
Gentlelady's time has expired. The member, for what purpose does the member from Pennsylvania, a member of the committee, rise?
I rise to strike the last word.
Gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. First, I want to say I rise in strong support of Judge Carter's amendment. It's absolutely necessary. Let me give you a few reasons why. First, I'm co-chair of the Cement Caucus along with Congressman Mike Ross of Arkansas. My district is one of the, if not the top cement-producing district in America. And I'll tell you, this is a critical industry to our infrastructure and certainly to the people of our country. Nationally, the cement industry employs about 17,000 Americans. We've lost more than 4,000 jobs in this industry since 2008. I am deeply concerned that EPA has failed to properly address the economic impact of this NESHAP rule. I'm extremely concerned about this for a variety of reasons. It seems that in many respects this industry seems to be specifically under attack by the EPA. This rule is critically flawed. It cobbles together a range of different performance characteristics for different pollutants without determining if it is possible for any single cement plant to comply with all the standards simultaneously. Nobody's determined if anyone can comply with this rule. Well, this means a lot to the people of my district. This rule is going to restrict our ability to remain competitive with foreign cement producers. Foreign imports currently make up about 20% of total U.S. cement sales. Most foreign operators, they basically are producers. They operate without anything close to the level of environmental standards currently in place in America. And while the EPA is trying to limit cement production with this ill-advised, job-destroying regulation, the Obama administration stimulus is providing financing to build a cement importation terminal in New York City. Stimulus dollars are being used to finance a cement importation terminal in New York City. The cement that's produced in my region supplies the New York market. It's the equivalent of one full plant. Why would we be subsidizing foreign producers of cement with our stimulus dollars? It makes no sense. So the federal government, on the one hand, is enabling foreign producers, and on the other hand, it is using the EPA to further cripple the domestic industry, which was flat on its back in 2010, and this year in 2011 is going to be even worse. We need a viable infrastructure. We need a viable cement industry in America. This amendment, I think, in an effective manner, addresses the problem. Somebody at EPA is going to have to answer for this, because I know my constituents were enormously offended that the federal government would be doing so much to undermine this industry on the one hand through stimulus, and then on the other hand using EPA to further limit their ability to operate. So again, this rule could force as many as 18 or more than, we estimate somewhere around 18 of more than the 90 U.S. cement plants to end operations. Others will be forced to dramatically reduce those operations. So again, I urge everybody in this chamber, everybody who's listening, paying attention, please support Judge Carter's amendment. It's important for American jobs and for American infrastructure. I'd be happy to yield.
Yielding, I'd like to address for a moment some of the things that were said by my friend on the other side of the aisle. It's true that there may be 1,300 new jobs, as he quoted, but the 1,300 new EPA inspectors are not jobs in the cement industry. The cost of doing the conversion, according to the industry spokesman, is about $3.5 billion industry-wide. And even then, they're not sure they're meeting all the standards that are being required by EPA. One, for instance, in this requirement of EPA is hydrochloric acid has never been considered a problem. Never been considered a problem by EPA, and all of a sudden there's a regulation concerning hydrochloric acid. This is a almost $4 billion cost to an industry whose total net worth is approximately $10 billion. That is a tremendous, tremendous burden to place on this industry. And quite honestly, what we're trying to accomplish by this, before this regulation is actually implemented, is to say, time out, we're not funding this till you get back to the table and start working out a reasonable way to save American jobs and not encourage foreign jobs to take jobs away from America. That's what this does. And obviously by this thing that's going on in the port in New York, that's even more horrendous, that we are actually attacking American jobs by our own efforts. And so I yield back to my friend.
Well, reclaiming my time, and my time has expired. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
The gentleman from California.
I seek recognition to strike the last word.
Gentleman strikes last word. You are recognized for 5 minutes.
I wanted to be recognized in opposition to this Carter Amendment. This has nothing to do with saving costs. This has nothing to do with lowering the deficit. What this amendment would do is to stop EPA from going ahead and enforcing a rule that they put into place dealing with mercury toxic emissions. It took them 10 years to get that rule in place. And why did they finally adopt a rule? Because mercury is a powerful neurotoxin that causes learning disabilities, developmental damage, especially in young children. Every year, an estimated 60,000 American newborn babies are threatened with a diminished ability to think and learn due to exposure to mercury pollution. Now, we have to balance things out. We want to protect the cement manufacturers. We want them to be profitable. But if we're going to let them continue with that mercury pollution, we're going to have 60,000 kids that are going to be born with neurological problems. Are we a Congress that cares about life? Well, I think we want both the industry to prosper and to stop the poisoning of our kids. So we asked the Environmental Protection Agency to adopt a rule. They met with the industry people. They put out a proposed rule. They got comments to their rule. They finally put it into place, and now we would be asked under this amendment to stop it. As Mr. Carter suggests, go back and renegotiate. Well, there's nothing to renegotiate. There's no rule in place. The National Association of Clean Air Agencies wrote a letter, which I'm going to make part of the record at the appropriate time, and they said, please oppose this amendment. They said, while there will be costs associated with the implementation of the rules, the benefits will far outweigh them. EPA estimates that the regulations will yield $7 billion to $18 billion annually in benefits, which is enormous when compared to the estimated $350 million to $950 million in annual costs that EPA has calculated. If you want to do it by dollars and cents, this is a real good deal for the American people. But if you want to do it for something even more important, life of babies and children, we're talking about keeping them from being poisoned. These standards that are being put in place will limit toxic mercury pollution from cement kilns, the third largest source of mercury pollution in America. These standards will reduce mercury pollution from cement kilns by 92%. They also reduce other hazardous air pollutants, such as lead, arsenic, dioxins, and benzene, which are known to cause cancer, birth defects, and other catastrophic health consequences. Reducing these toxic chemicals also reduces the fine particulate pollution, or soot, which interferes with heart and lung function and triggers strokes, heart attacks, and lung disease. The Carter Amendment would stop all of these efforts to protect the public health. And the only reason we've heard is that they fear there's going to be a cost to the cement industry. Yes, there will be, but that cost can be handled. And we've always heard throughout the debate on environmental laws that the costs are going to outweigh the benefits. A rigorous economic analysis was conducted, and the economic analysis shows that the benefits of this regulation far outweigh the costs to the industry. Let's not put corporate profits ahead of our children. I urge my colleagues not to agree to this amendment. They're common sense. They'll save money. They'll create jobs, and they'll save lives. And let me just tell you further what EPA estimated what these standards will prevent. Up to 2,500 premature deaths, 1,000 emergency room visits, 1,500 heart attacks, 17,000 cases of aggravated asthma, 32,000 cases of upper and lower respiratory symptoms. We're talking about reducing health costs that could amount to $18 billion of every year, and I think that's a great savings for the American people. I urge opposition to the Carter Amendment.
Does the gentleman yield?
I'm going to not yield because I think my time has expired, and I see my colleague about to ask. Well, let me yield to you if I still have.
Correct, your time has expired.
Is my time expired?
Yes.
I would have yielded, but it didn't work out.
For what purpose does the gentlelady from Missouri, who is a member of the committee, rise?
I move to strike the last word and
Gentlelady is
yield my
recognized
time
for
to
5
Mr.
minutes.
Dunn of Pennsylvania.
Thank you. Thank you. I just want to address a couple issues about the EPA. I've tried to point out very thoughtfully that the EPA has failed really to properly address the economic impact of this proposed rule. It is critically flawed. And let me restate once again why this rule is so flawed. Because it does bring together, cobbles together, a range of different performance characteristics for different pollutants without determining if it is possible for any single cement plant to comply with these standards simultaneously. That is the problem. And my distinguished colleague from California is making a point that there will be less emissions. That is true, because there will be fewer plants. They will not be emitting anything. We expect 18 plants that may be shuttered out of the 90 in this country. Tremendous capital investment for an industry critical to our basic infrastructure. These are high-paying jobs that we're talking about. We can't afford to lose that many more. That industry has become much more efficient over the years. These plants today produce far more than numerous plants would have produced years ago. So I just can't emphasize enough that as we are having this great debate about the nature of the economy and jobs, that we would be willfully using regulatory agencies that we know are going to cost thousands of jobs in America, high-paying jobs. You know, when is enough enough? I won't get into the New York plant again about how we're using stimulus dollars to bring cement from Peru to New York to serve the market. And the reason they're stating is, you know, they're going to kill more jobs than they're going to create with this importation terminal. I just can't get over this. They're bringing this cement here because they would prefer to have fewer cement trucks from Pennsylvania and even upstate New York and Maryland that supply New York. They would rather have fewer cement trucks on their roads. They would prefer to have huge ships coming in from Peru with cement rather than deal with the inconvenience of those cement trucks. You know, my region takes a lot of garbage, trash, waste from New York. We get garbage trucks every day in my district with New York garbage, and we landfill it. We're required to under the U.S. Constitution, under the Interstate Commerce Clause. It's been to the Supreme Court. We do that. You know, we're not shutting down our state line to them in that industry. The point is, it's about cement. It's about a basic industry. It's about American jobs. Judge Carter's amendment is the right thing. It's the right thing to do.
Yield back. Would the gentlelady yield?
I yield back to the gentlelady.
I yield the balance of my time to the gentleman from Texas.
And I thank you for yielding. I just want to point out what my friend Mr. Waxman was pointing out. Under the plan that's before us from the EPA, we're pretty well sure that 18 of our 90 plants are going to move offshore. So we get to add 18 plants to the people who are polluting this area of the United States at almost 100% pollutant. And good scientific evidence already tells us that 75% of the mercury pollution, which is the argument the gentleman made, is coming from outside the United States. Now, we're adding 18 new plants to the 75 polluters, and we're taking 18 plants away from the 25% side. And to me, I wonder how that balances out to make good sense for those poor sick kids that he was talking about. I mean, we're adding more pollution to the unregulated, full-scale polluters, and we're we're harming and taking American jobs. The fathers and mothers of those very children he was talking about, they're no longer going to have a job, and somebody in China or India is going to have that job. And I think the American people are pretty fed up with us trying to constantly ship good American jobs overseas. I hear my friends talk about we are outsourcing. This is a form of outsourcing by regulating us out of business and sending those jobs over to where they open with open arms and no regulations and lower wages. Come on in, make your cement, we'll ship it back to the United States, and use that New York terminal to bring it into the United States. And, you know, I think we need to rethink this. All we're asking is an implementation that doesn't drive us out of the country. That's just simple. It's not that tough. I yield back.
I believe my time may have expired.
I'll yield to you.
You don't have 25 seconds.
I yield my friend from California 20 seconds, which is all the time I have left.
If some of the pollution's coming from offshore from China, which is true, that's no excuse for us to allow more pollution to come from the sources here in the United States. And simply asking businesses to lower their emission levels does not mean we push them to do business overseas. American businesses have thrived even with environmental regulation.
Gentlelady's time has expired. For what purpose does the gentleman from Massachusetts rise?
I rise to strike the last word.
The gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
I thank the Chair very much. You know, what we're hearing this afternoon is a whole bunch of phony baloney numbers about how this is going to affect the cement industry, how this is going to affect the concrete industry. When in fact, industry after industry in the United States has been able to comply with rules which protect the public health and safety. First, let's just define what we're talking about and why American families are concerned about what the Portland cement industry is doing. Here's what it is. Airborne mercury, which settles in lakes and rivers, it accumulates in fish and shellfish, and in its most dangerous form, it is a neurotoxin that can lead to birth defects, stunted brain development. And, you know, since we're at the top of the food chain, and doctors and dietitians across the country are urging that families eat more fish, we are simultaneously urging them, especially those with small children or women who may be pregnant, to consume these fish that have the neurotoxins in them that we know leads directly to brain damage, to harm in children in our country. So this is a concrete example of what the Republican majority is now trying to do. This is kind of a regulatory earmark for a single industry aimed at giving them the right to pollute, to send mercury into our atmosphere and ultimately into the bodies of the children of our country, when we know that thousands of them are going to die from the consumption of that mercury, that thousands more will have an aggravation of the asthma which they already have. The same thing will be true for senior citizens. And yet, they're over here almost ignoring the health care impacts on families in our country. You know, we have people all across the country now going through food stores looking to find what the mercury count is in the food which they are purchasing for their families. Instead, what the majority wants to do here today is to put a pair of Portland cement shoes on the EPA and then throw them into the river, and if the EPA doesn't die from drowning, the mercury is going to kill them. That's ultimately what the impact is going to be of this amendment. And so I understand that if I was a trade association, I would be arguing you can't impose any kind of restrictions upon us to protect the children of our country. It's just too expensive. It's too hard for us to do. The Chinese will take advantage of us protecting children from having mercury put into their brains, into their systems. But you want to know what? That's not a good enough excuse for our country. Our country is supposed to be the leader in ensuring that the public health of our citizens is protected. And what has been constructed here is a very careful balance which ensures that the industry can survive and thrive at the same time that they are protecting the health and the safety of the children in our country. And there are other, by the way, many other people in the cement manufacturing industry who have contacted me, including companies in my own district, who do not support this position, and to say that it is actually quite within their power to be able to comply with these rules in terms of ensuring that mercury is reduced in the production of cement, in concrete in our country. So this is for the narrow number of small companies that are seeking to be exempted from having to participate in something that the vast majority of the industry can't comply with. And I do not believe that our country is going to sink to a level where the health, the safety of the children in our country are going to be allowed to be compromised by amendments on this House floor on behalf of a single small industry without any scientific justification except the bleedings that come from those that do not want to comply, knowing that the consequences will be the loss of thousands of lives and brain damage done to thousands of more who are children right now and will be affected by the vote that we cast here today.
Gentleman's time
I yield back
has
the balance of
expired.
my time.
The gentleman from Texas.
Thank the Chairman. I ask unanimous consent to revise and extend.
Do you strike the last word?
I rise to strike the requisite number of words, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
And I ask unanimous consent to revise and extend.
Without objection, so ordered.
I want to very quickly rise in strong support of Congressman Carter's amendment. I have 3 cement plants in my district. In Midlothian, Texas. They are the cement capital of Texas. Republicans are not for no regulation of mercury. We think this particular mercury rule is flawed. My good friend, the former chairman, Mr. Waxman of California, talked about the rigorous analysis that was done. His definition of rigorous and my definition of rigorous are not one and the same. We think that analysis was fairly flawed. I would point out that most pollutants, and we do agree that mercury is a pollutant, are measured in tons. Mercury emissions from these plants are measured in pounds per year. So mercury is a trace element of these pollutants. We think that we should go back and actually do a real economic analysis and also a health analysis. My good friend from Massachusetts was talking about the dangers of the health. Those are real dangers, but again, given the trace amounts of mercury that are emitted per year are in pounds, it is a very tenuous connection to say that the mercury from a cement plant has a direct correlation with some of the potential side effects that Mr. Markey was talking about. So I think this is a good amendment. I want to support it, and I now want to yield to my good friend Mr. Aiken for I believe he has an amendment to the amendment.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Move to strike the last word. And I had an amendment. Okay, I'll pass it on. I'll pass it on.
Okay. Then I'll yield.
Does is the gentleman offering a secondary amendment?
Mr. Speaker, I was intending to offer amendment number 181, but I've decided to withdraw the amendment, but was going to simply speak on the subject.
The Carter amendment is pending, and the gentleman from Texas has yielded his time.
I have is my good friend from Florida on
reclaiming his time.
I reclaim my time. Yield a minute to my good friend from Florida to speak on this amendment.
Recognize.
Just very briefly, look, let's get real. Everybody here supports protecting the environment. Every American supports protecting the environment. But we also support
protecting the jobs of the people that live within that environment. And some of us don't support arbitrary decisions that are made that are going to lose thousands of jobs, that are going to close plants. So, again, while there is a consensus in this body to protect the environment, there does not seem to be, Mr. Chairman, a consensus on protecting the jobs of the American people who are desperate for jobs. And without this amendment, we're going to lose more jobs. Let's have some common sense. Let's protect the environment and protect American jobs. I yield back.
And with that, I would
Would the gentleman yield?
yield to the author
Just
of
a
the
moment.
amendment.
I was having raised 4 children and being a person who cares about children, I was a little offended for being accused of wanting to harm children, and that is not the purpose of this. In fact, I would argue that if between 75 and 100% of the mercury pollutants and 2/3 of the American continent, of the country of America, is coming from foreign sources, and the only solution those who cannot meet these onerous requirements have to stay in business is to move to foreign countries where they do not regulate air quality, then I would argue that we are taking it away from the polluters by this amendment, by saying, wait a minute, let's look at this and talk it out. That's really what we're trying to do. And so I would argue that I'm trying to save the lives of American children, because the foreigners are polluting our air, and 75% of those pollutants are created by foreign companies, where the only choice for these people to stay in business is to move there. I yield back.
And I would yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Gentleman, for what purpose does the gentleman from New York rise?
Strike the last word.
Gentleman's recognized for 5 minutes.
I'd like to yield my time to the gentleman from California, Mr. Waxman.
I thank you for yielding. I just am astounded by some of the things that are said in the House, that there has not been a careful analysis of this proposal and the harm that it comes with these mercury pollutants, because the National Association of Clean Air Agencies, the people in your state that enforce the clean air laws, talked about the regulation yielding $7 billion to $18 billion annually in benefits, which is enormous when compared to the estimated $350 million to $950 million in annual costs. We have clear. No, I still want to complete my statement, then we'll see if the gentleman yields to me, wants to yield to you. Cement plants employ workers who also can get sick from all of this, but the American cement industry did us a report of their own on this. And in November of last year, analysis by the Portland Cement Association predicts that domestic cement production will increase more than 25% from today's levels by 2013 when these rules go into effect, and more than 50% by 2015. So they don't think they're going to be losing jobs under this proposal. My friend from Texas, Mr. Barton, says, well, these are trace amounts. This is a very intense, toxic substance. And he said there hasn't been a vigorous analysis. Well, we've got numbers with the analysis that we've had. I don't know what analysis the Cement Caucus has for us, but I think that Mr. Markey was correct when he stated this is an industry in certain areas that want to avoid spending money to stop the pollution from their plants. And it is just not a good excuse
Would
to
the gentleman
me.
yield
It is
on
not
that
a good
point?
excuse to me to say that because some of the mercury comes from overseas and other places, we should allow the mercury to continue right here in the United States. So I yield back my time to the
Would
gentleman.
the gentleman yield to me for a question before he yields to my good friend from New
Am I
York?
allowed to do that?
The gentleman from New York controls the
Oh,
time.
New York controls
yes.
the time. I'm sorry. Would the gentleman from New York yield? I thank my friend Congressman Serrano. Would Mr. Waxman agree with me that if you get one of these new squiggly mercury bulbs and break it, you're going to be exposed to more mercury than the amount of mercury you're exposed to from a cement plant?
Absolutely not. I don't agree with that. I haven't seen anything. I haven't seen
think
any
that's a
studies on the
factually
subject.
correct statement.
I don't know enough to answer that question, but it does
Well, you
seem
might
to me
check it out,
unlikely.
because some of the benefits and some of the costs that you talk about are not borne out in the real world when you do a real analysis.
Now, I trust your analysis. I should trust your analysis more than the Environmental Protection Agency, OMB, and the people that run the Air Pollution Control District.
Gentleman from New York controls the time.
Reclaiming my time, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. For what purpose does the gentleman from Pennsylvania rise?
Missouri?
Missouri rise.
We have an amendment. We've got to vote on this one.
Hey.
Vote.
Oh,
The question is on the amendment offered by the gentleman from Texas. All those in favor say aye. Aye. Those opposed say nay. No. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it.
Mr. Chair, we would ask for a recorded vote on that.
The amendment is agreed. The gentleman is asked for a recorded vote pursuant to Clause 6 of Rule 18. Further proceedings on the amendment offered by the gentleman from Texas will be postponed. What purpose does the gentleman from Missouri now rise?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. To strike the last word.
Gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
And, Mr. Speaker, I have an amendment number 181, which it's my plan to withdraw following a comment here.
Does the gentleman offer the amendment?
Yes, Mr. Speaker, I do. Oh, I do not? I don't offer it.
The gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes under his request to strike the last word.
Mr. Speaker, the amendment that I was thinking I was going to offer, and actually we can't, is on the Energy Independence and Security Act of 2007. It's an interesting topic because we're going back again once more to the subject of mercury, but really we're going to a more basic subject than mercury, and that is the subject of freedom, because this Energy Independence and Security Act of 2007 is a de facto ban on the plain old light bulb that Americans have known for a long time. It's the incandescent bulb. And this de facto ban essentially says that all of the new light bulbs have to be these mercury vapor fluorescent light bulbs. And so the question that comes to my mind is, aside from the benefits of one type of light bulb over another, and you could argue the benefits, the mercury vapor light bulb is a little more expensive, but it saves energy, but the incandescent light bulb is, it burns more energy, but it doesn't have any mercury that you're bringing into your living room. And the point, though, is, don't we trust our constituents to pick the kind of light bulb that they want? I'm just wondering if there's anybody in this chamber who wants to stand up and vote and say, I'm going to tell my constituents what kind of light bulb they ought to buy. I mean, light bulbs are used in a lot of different contexts, a lot of different situations. And if people want one of these mercury vapor bulbs that's got good efficiency, fine, let them buy one. But don't tell them they can't buy another kind of bulb which may meet their circumstances. And I think that's a kind of arrogance that the public is really fed up with out of Congress, is when we have this arrogant attitude that we're going to tell people even what kind of light bulb to buy. And so what my amendment was going to do was, of course, to strike this piece of legislation. Technically, we can't do that on this appropriations bill, so we have to wait for a different venue in order to do it. But I would conclude with the observation that for decade after decade in America, the symbol of innovation and bright ideas was always the light bulb, and unfortunately this bill is a bulb that just seems to barely get dim. Thank you. And
gentleman's time has expired. For what purpose does the gentleman from Louisiana rise?
Mr. Chairman, I have amendment number 204 at the desk.
The clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment number 204, printed in the congressional record, offered by Mr. Scalise of Louisiana.
Gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. We've seen over the last 2 years under President Obama a very disturbing proliferation of czars, these unappointed, unaccountable people who are literally running a shadow government, heading up these little fiefdoms that nobody can really seem to identify where they are, what they're doing, but we do know that they're wielding vast amounts of power. Many of them have been making six-figure salaries, and yet you can't find out exactly what they're doing, yet you've got the separate cabinet that's actually appointed goes through the scrutiny of Senate confirmation, which is the process that is supposed to be followed for people that make these kind of high-level decisions. In fact, I support the ability of the President to organize his administration, and of course, if you look at Article 2, Section 2 of the Constitution, it lays out the process for having these types of appointments, and it requires Senate confirmation. Yet you've got this shadow government that literally completely avoided the transparency and the accountability of that Senate scrutiny. What we do in this amendment, which actually sacks these czars, we actually go through, and I'll start with the Obamacare czar. Of course, we had a vote here on the House floor to repeal Obamacare, which I'm proud to have supported. Hope we continue to see move through the Senate. But in the meantime, we just had a hearing the other day. Over 900 companies have already gotten exemptions. Went and, I guess, lined up at the White House and must have known somebody right over there and were able to get exempted from this law that the President says is so important, so great, going to solve all these problems, and yet 900 companies have already been able to get secret exemptions. How have they done this? Who didn't get an exemption? Of course, our local businesses on Main Street would love to get that exemption. They didn't get that opportunity. We can't even find out who got these exemptions. So we're getting rid of the Obamacare czar. Let's go to the climate czar. Of course, you've got a person in there right now that supposedly is going to be leaving. This is a person who's continued to do things behind closed doors. In fact, when the moratorium on drilling came out, it was found out that it was the climate study to try to say that scientists that the President appointed recommended a moratorium on drilling. Turned out the scientists didn't say that at all. The White House actually had to apologize for the actions of the climate czar for what they did. Again, behind closed doors, nobody can find out exactly what they're doing. So if she's leaving, let her leave and take the funding too. The global warming czar. There's actually a czar out there trying to still impose a cap-and-trade regime. Of course, Congress has rejected cap-and-trade. We've seen study after study. In fact, Spain came up with a study that showed what happened when they tried to implement a cap-and-trade regime. And what they found out was for every green job that they created, they lost over 20 full-time jobs in the private sector. And they detail that out very well in their study about what that policy does. National Association of Manufacturing said cap-and-trade would run over 3 million jobs out of this country. Yet we've got a global warming czar that's running around out there with taxpayer money promoting a policy that would destroy jobs that this Congress doesn't even support. Again, you've got the green job czar. The green job czar, they haven't even filled the job of the green job czar since the last one resigned in disgrace. The last green job czar we had left in disgrace because he expressed comments embracing communism and actually tried to blame the government, the American government, for September 11th attacks. And so, of course, that person left in disgrace. The job's still not even vacant. Let's get rid of it. The Guantanamo Bay closure czar we get rid of in this amendment. Guantanamo Bay, in fact, if you look at it, it's estimated that we'd have to spend over $200 million to build another facility to hold them. Nobody wants them. New York said, we surely don't want to try these terrorists on American soil right down the street from where the World Trade Centers were attacked. And yet you've got a Guantanamo Bay closure czar when the President himself now has even backed off of closing Guantanamo Bay. And I support him in that. We shouldn't be closing Guantanamo Bay. But we surely shouldn't have a czar that's running around out there doing who knows what for closing down Guantanamo Bay. There's a fairness doctrine czar that we get rid of. A fairness doctrine czar that's trying to undermine the First Amendment rights of talk radio hosts. You know, there may be some people on the other side that don't like some things said on talk radio. That's their prerogative. The beauty is you've got a First Amendment that dictates that, and you've got a marketplace. So the bottom line is it's time that we reestablish our responsibility as a legislative branch. Let's get back to those constitutional principles, and let's get rid of these czars. We shouldn't have the government running car companies. We shouldn't have the government running the shadow government, and we shouldn't have all these czars. I urge my colleagues to support this amendment, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back. The chair notes that the House is not in order. The committee is not in order. Thank you. For what purposes does the gentleman from New York rise?
Strike the last word.
Gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
I rise in strong opposition to this amendment. You know, the so-called czars in the Obama administration are basically exercising a traditional function of the White House staff, which is advising the President coordinating policy on complex issues that cut across cabinet departments and federal agencies. Let's take a look at one example. One target of criticism has been the climate change czar. But what cabinet secretary or other agency head would otherwise have the lead on climate change issues? The administrator of EPA, the Secretary of Energy, the Secretary of the Interior, the Secretary of State, because climate change is fundamentally an international issue. The fact is that all these officials and many more have a role, and that's why the President has designated a senior White House staff member to coordinate activity and policy making on climate changes. They do not have legal authority to take action. Rather, that final decision-making authority can only be exercised by heads of agencies or other officials properly appointed, and in most cases confirmed by the Senate. In modern times, there's nothing unusual about the White House and its staff playing a leading role in policy making, especially on issues important to the President. But let me touch on a subject now that some people may not want to touch on. Look, let's be honest, this is not about czars. This is about the person that lives in the White House. Today, we're going to see amendments that say we should not have repairs on the White House structure. Tonight, we're going to see an amendment that says, listen to this, that the President should not have paid for by the taxpayers a teleprompter. Can you believe this? This may be the 6 o'clock national news.
Will the gentleman yield?
I'm not going to yield for now to my sister, even if the amendment has been withdrawn.
Oh, okay.
But
well, I just thought we
there's
should
an amendment out there about the teleprompter. So I'm going to give some folks on the other side, with all due respect and love and affection, some advice. When you look at the White House, think of it as the monument it is. Think of it as the structure where the President of any party lives. Don't get hung up on the fact that he lives there. Notice I didn't mention the name because I don't want to upset you. Don't get upset at who uses the teleprompter. Don't get upset at whose plumbing needs repair in the White House for 50 years. Make believe it's the last president. Please repair the White House. Please allow him to have staff. Please allow him to be president. But don't get hung up on the fact that he is the president, because I know that upsets you. You can't accept the fact that he is the president. So don't let that bother you. Just concentrate on the issue and concentrate, Mr. Speaker, I think we should concentrate on the fact that the White House structure itself is a building we should keep in good shape. It falls under my subcommittee's jurisdiction and Ms. Emerson's chairmanship. We have a president who may at times use a teleprompter. Let him use it, because if we get into that, then our staff may not be able to write notes for us in the future, because it's the same thing. So, yeah, sometime it may not be this president, it may be another. I wish I could mention his name right now, but I know it upsets the heck out of many people on that side. So don't go after him. Just do what needs to be done. And this is a terrible amendment and should be defeated.
Gentleman's time has expired. The gentlelady from Missouri's.
Move to strike the last word.
Gentlelady's recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I would love to allow my very close friend and colleague from New York to continue. However, I will say that I do agree with him, and we will discuss this later this evening, that in fact the White House is the White House, and it's a historic building, and it should be cared for. But the issue at hand is the number of people not subject to Senate confirmation who work there. And I want to rise in support of our colleague from Louisiana's amendment to address the issue of czars in this administration, and I will admit that there were too many in several of the past administrations as well. And I also hope that the Government Oversight and Reform Committee will actually mark up the Scalise bill so that we can address this issue once and for all. I do know for a fact that in spite of what my good friend from New York said, the health care czar, who is no longer in that position, and it's why we have actually eliminated that position as well as the climate change position in the continuing resolution. I believe that several colleagues had set many meetings with the health care czar in the White House when that position was filled, and that she was actually coordinating all of the work done on the current health care law. So the fact that, or the statement that these folks don't have any power is absolutely not true based on personal experience with the person who actually held that position. So I love the idea of getting rid of some more of these czars. It will save us a lot of money. We have excellent people, even if we don't agree with them, who are the heads of agencies and departments in the government, and they should be allowed to do their jobs themselves instead of having interference from even more people. So with that, I support the amendment from Mr. Scalise and yield back my time.
Gentlelady yields back her time. For what purpose does the gentleman from Massachusetts rise?
To strike the requisite number of words.
Gentleman's recognized for 5 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, being of an optimistic nature, I look for silver linings, so I welcome the fact that my colleagues on the other side have decided to adopt gender-neutral language, because a large number of the czars would have been called czarinas in the old days. So I appreciate the fact that we've gotten beyond sex stereotyping of people. I guess they were in a little bit of a hurry. The gentleman from Missouri has spoken, the gentleman from Louisiana, and they listed the czars they didn't like. They overlooked one. Maybe it was hard to read. Here's one of the ones they want to eliminate. By the way, you notice that many of the ones they want to eliminate have already been eliminated. They're not there. So they are denying funding for non-existent positions, climate change, health care.
I'll
yield to the gentlewoman.
But the money and the funds still exist. So,
well, then
so we're trying to save some money.
Okay,
here.
but then rather than deal with it this way, I would have thought in the CR, you're telling me that the Republican Appropriations Committee majority funded some non-existent positions. I would have some advice, Mr. Chairman, for the gentlewoman. Next time, don't do that, and we wouldn't have this problem. But there are some positions that they did fund that they would defund that still exist. And I understand they were in a hurry, so they forgot to mention all of them. They talked about climate change and they talked about health care. Here's the one they forgot to mention. The Special Master for TARP, Executive Compensation, Department of the Treasury. That is the Special Master, Ms. Gagan, whose job it is to monitor excessive compensation at those TARP recipients who got special assistance and still owe the federal government money. So what they want to do is knock out the person whose job it is to monitor compensation at AIG and at General Motors and at Chrysler and at Ally.
Will the gentleman yield?
Yes.
I'm pleased to tell my good friend that that position is removed from this legislation as well.
I have an amendment which says Special Master for TARP, Executive Compensation, Department of the Treasury. So the amendment I have defunds and says you can't pay.
In fact, this amendment...
Excuse me, I haven't yielded yet.
Oh, pardon me.
I want to make it clear. This is the amendment offered by the gentleman from Louisiana. The one I got says, lines 18 and 19, Special Master for TARP, Executive Compensation, Department of the Treasury. Is the gentleman telling me I was given a defective copy? I'll yield.
Yes, I must tell you, my good friend, that you must have received a copy that perhaps missed a page.
Well, let me ask you,
because
Parliament,
do you have the diversity czar or the
I take back my time. I would tell the gentleman, I would ask then not to come out of my time, I would hope a parliamentary inquiry. What's the text of the amendment? This is the one we were given. Could I get a reading of the text of the amendment, or could I get a copy of the amendment? Because I have an amendment.
The gentleman can ask unanimous consent for that.
I would ask unanimous consent.
Would the gentleman yield for a moment?
Well, if I can get
I'm a little confused on your question, and I may be able to clarify.
I'll yield to the gentleman from Texas.
Are you...
Excuse me, I will yield. Does that have anything to do with cement? If you mention cement, I'm not yielding.
Promise not to mention cement.
Then I yield.
Promise not to mention
I yield. Because where I come from, cement was not good news for the people who were put into it. I yield to the gentleman.
I got you. If you're asking the question, are we attempting to defund that czar, we are.
Well, then I take back my time, and I would ask unanimously that special debate time be allotted so the gentleman from Texas can debate the gentleman from Missouri, because they seem to be undecided between them about it. So the question I have is, this amendment, as it was presented, says you can't pay the person whose job it is to stop excessive compensation at TARP recipients. Now, the gentleman from Missouri says it's not in there. I got a bad copy.
No, we misunderstood you, sir.
Oh, okay, so it is in here. So this amendment would say to AIG and General Motors and Chrysler and Ally, the financial company, no one will now be supervising what you do, and even though you haven't yet paid back the federal government, there will be no enforcement of restrictions on your bonuses, no enforcement of restrictions on your compensation. I should note, by the way, in the condemnation of these czar positions, one of the ones that's now vacant that they bravely get rid of is the senior advisor on the auto industry. That's one of the great successes of the Bush-Obama administration and transition.
Will the gentleman yield just for a moment?
Not at this point, because I would first tell the gentleman if she'd work it out with the gentleman from Texas and then come up with a joint answer. But I want to make my other point. I've yielded several times. One of the czars they are complaining about presided over a Bush-Obama transition policy that kept General Motors and Chrysler alive. We have auto industries flourishing in America and suppliers today. That was partly because of this position that's now vacant that they want to get rid of retroactively. But I will now yield, and please explain to me what it means when you say you are going to deny the funds for the special master for TARP. I'll yield to whoever wants me to yield. The gentleman from Kentucky? The gentlewoman from Missouri?
I would just like to tell my friend that the Office of Financial Stability, which does, in the Department of Treasury, which does oversee all of this, still remains, and it is mandatory
funding. All right, well, now
funding.
I take it back. I take back my time. So now the third answer I get is, yes, they do get rid of the special master. There's an office there with nobody heading it. I would ask for an additional 2 minutes, having yielded so much of my time.
No. Is that a unanimous vote?
I hope we can expeditiously move.
Well, but just after 2 minutes, having yielded so much of my time.
Will the gentleman yield? Does the gentleman from Kentucky object to the unanimous consent for 2 additional minutes?
No, I do not.
Without objection, the gentleman is recognized.
I appreciate that. I wouldn't abuse the privilege, but I did have a lot of my time taken up.
Will the gentleman yield briefly?
Yes.
To the czars, I say, nit.
Well, I will leave to the gentleman to work out his Lenin fantasy, but I want to reiterate what this amendment now does. There is a special master, a high-visibility individual, whose job it is to prevent excessive compensation from those TARP recipients that are still out there. AIG, General Motors and Chrysler, and Ally. This amendment strikes it. This amendment leaves us without a person of great responsibility, and I think that, and by the way, it's only the top 100 employees, and there were 2 levels, 25 and 75. I cannot understand why members would want to send this signal, because many of these positions are already vacant, that one of the positions that is not vacant is our effort to put limits on compensation, bonuses, and other excessive compensation for those entities that still owe the federal government money. And why our colleagues decide that that position should be abolished and a high-level individual charged with that responsibility should not be there is baffling to me. I cannot believe that that's what people think the American people want, namely a restriction on the restriction, a relaxation on the restriction of bonuses and other compensation paid to large recipients who have not yet paid back their TARP money. And I thank the gentleman from Kentucky for his consideration.
Gentleman's time has expired. Is she on the committee? The gentleman from Kansas.
Yes,
for what
Mr.
purpose
Chairman,
do you rise?
I move to strike the last word.
Gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate the opportunity to speak on this amendment, very similar to one I was going to offer as well. This amendment, as we know, would strike the climate change czar, the global warming czar, also known as the cement czar as well. Mr. Chairman, all kidding aside, my question I would have is what is the President afraid of? This is not an issue of what is covered here. The issue is that the President has overstepped his constitutional authority in naming these czars and disregards the separation of powers and refuses to submit these names for confirmation. And it's, of course, in my opinion, one of many examples of executive excess from this administration. Czars are unaccountable, unelected, and they are given considerable authority which undermines the rule of law. Again, why is the President afraid of submitting these names for consideration? I would argue probably because they might not be confirmed. More than 30 czars have been appointed by the President. Not all those are directed at in this amendment. But this amendment seeks to defund approximately 9 of these czars, including czars to oversee global warming policy, as well as the closure of Gitmo. Mr. Chairman, I would like to note that just yesterday the administration indicated that if they did catch Osama bin Laden, they would send him to Gitmo. At the same time, they have a czar that continues to close Gitmo. Certainly, the President has the authority to appoint staff as necessary, but at the same time, his advisors are not there to make law, Mr. Chairman. That is our job. That is the job of the Senate. This is an issue of whether the legislative branch is going to write the laws, Mr. Chairman. Supporters of this type of style of government suggest in the past other presidents have appointed czars, and Mr. Chairman, czars might not have started with the Obama administration, but they should end with this budget. With that, I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back. For what purpose is the gentlelady